like to spend the rest of my time with you reviewing some of the salutary secondary effects of Hamilton's blessed debt. Foremost among those was the Bank of the United States. Chartered in 1791, the bank, or First Bank, the BUS, the BUS, as it is sometimes called, was a commercial bank owned in part by private investors and in part by the federal government, at least until it sold off its shares at an immense profit. The institution, which eventually established branches in 8 seaport cities, primarily made short-term loans to businesses, including merchants and manufacturers, but it was also the federal government's bank. It was responsible for paying interest on the national debt when it fell due 4 times a year, transferred money from where the government earned it, which was mostly in the major port cities, as I just said, mostly from tariff and tonnage duties, to where the government spent it, which was mostly along the frontier in military forts and wherever bondholders lived, which, as I explained just a couple of minutes ago, was throughout the country. Perhaps most importantly, the BUS stood ready to lend the government money should it find that its debts outstripped its current revenue. The Bank of the United States also acted as a lender of last resort during the financial panics that hit the nation's financial system in 1791 and, harder and more infamously, in 1792. Under Hamilton's guidance, it implemented what would later be called Bagehot's Rule, after Walter Bagehot, the founding editor of The Economist magazine, who described the rule in his 1873 book, Lombard Street, A Description of the Money Market in London. I've taken to calling the rule Hamilton's, nay, Bagehot's Rule. Nay is spelled N-E-E, and it's a genealogical term that means originally called. Hamilton did not spell the rule out in a book, but he implemented it perfectly, especially during the 1792 panic, when he persuaded bankers to lend freely at a penalty rate to all who could post sufficient collateral, i.e., his 3s, 6s, and deferreds. The market soon steadied, and the young American economy continued to grow robustly, an expansion that had begun soon after Hamilton announced his funding program. The bubbles that burst in 1791 and 1792 included government bonds, but also the stocks of the BUS and the nation's handful of other commercial banks, including the Bank of New York, which Hamilton had helped to found shortly after the British pulled out of Manhattan after the American Revolution. Before his untimely demise, Hamilton also helped to found 2 other corporations, another bank here in New York, and the Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufacturers over in Paterson, New Jersey. All 3 had difficulties obtaining charters at first, so Hamilton helped them to establish workarounds that had the effect of easing entry into the corporate sector, access to which state governments jealously guarded at first. Thanks to Hamilton's loopholes, which established perpetual succession and even limited liability by contract rather than statute, state governments realized that they had to ease their charter requirements or face the formation of numerous unchartered, which is to say completely unregulated, joint stock companies. Due to the ease of entry forced by Hamilton's legal genius, over 23,000 for-profit corporations received special acts of incorporation in the United States before the Civil War, and another 10,000 plus were chartered under general acts of incorporation. That was far more corporations per capita than any other nation on earth, including Britain. Though I have to add the caveat that the mother country's corporations were larger on average, or a guy named Leslie Hanna is going to come after me. Oh, some of you know him. Okay. Early U.S. corporations were engaged in transportation, including bridges, canals, roads, and railroads, finance, including commercial and savings banks, fire, marine, and life insurers, and building and loan societies, manufacturing, including everything from cotton and woolen textiles to steam engines, utilities, including water and gas light, and services, from cemeteries to hotels. Shares in all those endeavors traded in the same markets that had developed to exchange Hamilton's bonds, and eventually many businesses and state governments learned from the federal government and began selling bonds to finance their operations as well. What Hamilton's funding plan amounted to was nothing short of a financial revolution. In just 5 years, America went from being backwards and bankrupt, without public credit or even a clear unit of account in which to denominate debts, to a nation with a well-defined dollar, taxes sufficient to pay the interest on a large debt composed of liquid bonds owned throughout the nation and abroad, and small but growing commercial banking and insurance systems. Hamilton's financial revolution, in turn, made possible the agricultural revolution described by Winifred Rothenberg, Paul Rohde, and others, whereby farm efficiency increased as crop yields jumped and local transportation revolution, bridges, short canals, and turnpikes made it less expensive to bring goods to market. The agricultural revolution freed laborers from farm work, making them available to work on regional transportation connections like long canals, railroads, and steamship lines. Improved transportation meant a much lower cost per ton mile, which rendered feasible the growth of both cities and factories in the nation's vast interior. Thanks to the series of economic transformations initiated by Hamilton's financial revolution, the North and even parts of the South industrialized before the Civil War. If you didn't know that already, that's because Alfred Chandler and other early business historians didn't have very good archival skills, and they just kind of assumed the antebellum economy away. Since passage of the U.S. Constitution, white male citizens enjoyed a government that protected life, liberty, and property from invaders, foreign and domestic. The bonds that composed its national debt traded regularly in public markets, so there was constant affirmation of the government's willingness and ability to fulfill its promises. The new government created by the Constitution was key. While places like Western New York experienced agricultural, transportation, and industrial revolutions and thrived economically, adjacent areas in Upper Canada with identical culture, climate, flora, and fauna remained economically backward. Canada, after all, was still subject to the whims of a distant monarch and his or her placement in the New World, and de facto ruled by unelected oligarchic cliques bent on rent-seeking. I'm related to Marco Rubio, by the way, if anyone's wondering. No, not really. Only after Canadians won their independence from the cliques in the 1830s and 1840s, and from the Crown in 1867, it's 150 years ago, by the way, and give it up for Canada. They celebrated their... Only after they got rid of the Crown and these cliques did Canada begin to catch up to America economically. By the time that I personally began making beer runs to Ontario in the late 1980s, does it show? Western New York and Canada were virtually indistinguishable, except for the drinking age and the metric system, you know. Virtual economic parity, I'm told, had been reached several decades earlier. Now, if anything, the Toronto half of Tarafalo, or Bufferonto, if you will, but that stretch that goes from the eastern part of Lake Erie down both sides of the Niagara River to both the Niagara Falls, and then on the west and northern shore of Lake Ontario. The Toronto half, the Canadian half, looks much better than the Western New York half, where I went to school. The reason for the present disparity may well be that the U.S. national debt has become excessive, in Hamilton's sense. It is now larger than the nation's annual GDP and seemingly out of control, while Canada's national debt is just 66% of its GDP and well under control. While the nominal national debt stayed about the same during Hamilton's tenure as Treasury Secretary, strong economic and population growth meant that debt as a percentage of GDP dropped dramatically. Thereafter, thanks to the fiscal constitution, which was a series of rules about borrowing and taxation, like don't borrow without dedicating a tax to service and repay a debt, that Hamilton put into place, the national debt increased as a percentage of GDP only during wars and depressions and after territorial acquisitions, like the Louisiana Purchase. After each of those borrowing binges, economic growth and small budget surpluses combined to reverse the trend. As recently as the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio improved cyclically. So much so that at the end of Bill Clinton's second term, there was genuine concern that U.S. government bonds would be completely extinct for the second time in U.S. history. Now, what are all those bond traders going to do, and what is the Fed going to do, and so on and so forth? But as we know, that was not to be. As debt optimists swept into power and destroyed Hamilton's fiscal constitution under the cover of putative wars on terror and drugs. In fact, all Bush 2 and Obama have done is to borrow and spend in order to win votes. Taxing and spending is too risky as people immediately feel taxes. In fact, they feel taxes before they're actually imposed a lot of times. Taxing and spending, so most people, however, pay little attention to borrowing. And the debt optimists are there now, telling them that they don't need to worry. You don't need to worry about the national debt. Everything's going to be just fine. Which is true, if you're one of those 12 people who owe more than they own and aren't reliant on bonds, Social Security, or other forms of fixed income, right? And everything will be fine.